I'd like to welcome you to a further session of our lecture series, Demokratie Reloaded. In this lecture series, we don't want to deplore the decline of democracy, but we are looking for new forms of democracy. So the idea is not so much to revive an old concept, but rather to reload it. That's why we called it Demokratie Reloaded. Rarely we make such a strike as with our guest tonight, Michael Hardt. He's professor for literature at the Duke University, and he's a very productive author. And as an author, he has three characteristic features. First, he is mainly a collective author, I mean part of a collective, for example with Giorgio Agamben or with Paolo Virno, and best known, of course, in the duo with Toni Negri. So the second particularity is that the duo Negri-Hardt has produced an incredible contradictio in adjecto, a contradiction in the adjunction, because with Empire they produced a theory bestseller. They somehow rocked the theory scene and they became rock stars. I read today that when Michael Hardt was presenting Empire in Berlin, there were more than 700 people at the Volksbühne. So this theory bestseller became the founding text of the anti-globalists, the founding text of a movement which is not based on founding texts. And the same goes with the new book, which we want to present tonight. And the German title is Demokratie, wofür wir kämpfen. The first sentence of the book is, "This is not a manifesto." This is a kind of Magritte sentence. Ceci n'est pas un pipe. This is not a pipe. It is not a manifesto. It is a catch-up manifesto of an ongoing social movement. And the last contradiction in adjecto of this theory production is the production of a left hope narrative. A hope narrative after the end of the meta-narratives. In an interview, Michael Hardt was asked about his optimism. And he said, his optimism is the consequence of his viewpoint. And his viewpoint is the one of the struggle. And now it is a good time for struggle. In that sense, welcome to the Kreisky Forum, Michael Hardt.
Thanks very much to the forum, to Isolde especially. I hadn't heard this part, Demokratie Reloaded, before, and I need to reflect on the reloaded part, because it does have a bit of a weaponized democracy feel to it. Or I'm thinking about what is the violence involved in democracy and the reloaded, the weapon character of it. I'll think about that. Maybe I'll come up with something by the time I get to it. What I want to do, what I've prepared is not exactly a presentation of this pamphlet that Toni and I wrote together that Isolde mentioned, but in some ways thinking beyond it. What I in fact want to start with is to articulate what seems to me the importance and the legacy of the cycle of struggles that began in 2011, and then to pose two problems about them, and then I'll try to work through those two problems. All of it really around the notion of the right to the common. In fact, first I'll talk about the common, and then I'll talk about what it might mean to call this a right, and that'll be the all of it. So I'll tell you when I get to the end. And my understanding is about 45 minutes is a good amount of time. If I sense you're lagging. If you don't understand my English, I'll try to notice and slow down. But so far, it seems that everyone's okay. And you can even hear me, too. So, okay, so first, I guess I should say that I'm thinking of as a cycle of struggles, the various encampments and occupations that began in 2011, or really began already in December of 2010 in Tunisia, continuing to Egypt, leaping across the Mediterranean in a way with the 15th of May encampments of the Indignados starting in Spain, continuing in Athens at least, probably also one could consider the tents that summer in Tel Aviv, as long as you don't call that an occupation. And then by the time we get to Wall Street in September 17th and that occupation in Zuccotti Park, there's already a year at their backs of different encampments and occupations. One of the as the U.S.er, one of the advantages of thinking about this as a cycle, of thinking of the relationship among these, is that it decenters the U.S. and the Occupy movement in a bit. There's a tendency, and I don't know if you would get the same one from here, but there's a tendency in the U.S., of course, to think that everything starts in the U.S. And so that after there were the different encampments and occupations after Occupy Wall Street started, in the U.S. news media was always that everything started at Wall Street and then went elsewhere, whereas really Wall Street was really the end, I think, or a certain kind of point of arrival of a series of movements in the same year. But when I say a cycle of struggles, I don't mean that all of these things were the same, and certainly not that the different encampments and occupations entered into the same political context. Rather, the way I think of a cycle is that in each new location, in each new political context, they have to translate and innovate with the practices and ideals that they've been inspired with elsewhere. So that, I mean, I think one way one can see this cycle is just in a anecdotal, personal way. You know, that the first starting the encampments in Madrid and Barcelona were thinking that they were taking up the baton from Tahrir Square. That those who started the idea of Occupy Wall Street in New York had been to Tunisia during the summer to learn from what had happened there. So that there's a certain kind of personal role of it. But at a maybe a more theoretical level, more important level, I would say that they translated or attempted to translate the ideals and practices into the new terrain. You know, so that, for instance, at Occupy Wall Street, they would say, well, in Tahrir Square, they were protesting against tyranny. We're protesting against the tyranny of finance, and that has a certain continuity, but also obviously a difference and requires different tactics. If I were smarter, if I had paid more attention at science class in high school, I'd know something about. I think it's like they're viruses that transform themselves with different hosts. That's the kind of thing I mean with this cycle of struggles. That think about this cycle as a virus that when it enters each host, like one host in Egypt, a different host in Spain, a different host. Is that making any sense from anyone who knows anything about biology? Anyway, if you can imagine, I think it works something like that. So that's the kind of thing I have in mind, thinking of this as a cycle. One of the problems that immediately rises for me regarding this, or a challenge, let's say, more than a problem, is about the discontinuity of the movements. Already when I'm talking about a cycle like this, I'm thinking about a spatial discontinuity, you know, something that leaps across the Mediterranean, across different continents, and is not in that sense unified, but rather has a spatial discontinuity. But even more so, it seems to me, a problem is with the temporal discontinuity. The way these movements that began in 2011, these encampments and occupations, function, have been characterized by their temporary, ephemeral nature. In fact, I would see a kind of relationship, but a discontinuous relationship, with the previous cycle of struggles especially in North America and Europe, that is the alter globalization movements from 10 years earlier. Thinking of that too as a cycle, starting perhaps with November 1999 in Seattle, continuing in Quebec City, Washington, Gothenburg, Prague, perhaps finishing a cycle in Geneva in 2001. So I would say there's a kind of temporal discontinuity that in some ways what appeared first in Seattle in 1999 reappeared in Zuccotti Park in New York in 2011. That there's that also that temporal discontinuity of ephemeral movements that then reappear. In fact, I should pause for a minute to say, just to give also a context about this cycle, about its qualities and its difference from the alter globalization movement. There are three things that stand out for me. The first is really something that it shares, that the encampments shared with the alter globalization movement, and that's what I would call the multitude form of it. The fact of there not being centralized leadership, or even a single leader, and instead an aspiration towards horizontal and democratic organization of the movement itself. This was something. I mean, I'm still in the mode where I'm trying to convince you, because I assume that for some of you, you have a certain skepticism when I try to pose these different movements as posing one cycle, but. I would think that that for the occupation, the encampment in Tahrir Square in Cairo, you could certainly see something like the multitude form there, or at least remember. So there were 18 days they occupied Tahrir Square. At least in the New York Times, in the U.S. media in general, each day the newspapers tried to find a leader. Like one day it was El-Baradei, the physicist. The next day it was that Google executive, I can't remember his name. The next day they choose somebody else. Like each day they choose a leader. What they couldn't understand is that there wasn't a leader either in the square or outside the square, but instead a complex network of unequal groups negotiating with each other in the square in something like what I'm calling multitude form. That's also the way I would characterize the Indignados organization in Spain. Occupy Wall Street and the different Occupy movements also have that same characteristic of refusing representation and refusing leadership in that way. So that's the first characteristic that I think is similar to the alter globalization movement that then comes back as repeated, resonates maybe with these encampments and occupations. The second one is a contrast, whereas the alter globalization cycle was characterized fundamentally by its nomadism, like its movement. In fact, that's what I think that was also a strength, but it was certainly a weakness that was criticized within the movements and certainly outside them. This summit hopping, the movement even of specific activists from one summit to the next, et cetera, and focusing on global issues that in some ways was disconnected from local issues. Instead, one of the characteristics of this cycle, the 2011 cycle, is their sedentary nature, their refusal to move. In fact, that's how they function, is refusing to move. And partly consequently, or relatedly, the rootedness in the territory of each of these encampments. Rootedness in the territory in the sense that these, for instance, the Indignados call them commissions, like in addition to the General Assembly, there are commissions on very local neighborhood issues about sexual violence in this neighborhood, about people who can't pay the loans on their house in this neighborhood. So this rootedness in the territory and sedentary nature characterizes these movements. And the third, I would say, in contrast to the alter globalization movement, in which justice seemed to be a reigning political concept, often calling itself global justice movement, it seems to me that democracy is the overarching term, the term with the most tension and creative energies associated with it in the series of encampments and occupations. That's partly due, undoubtedly due, and having unpredictable effects from this having started in Tunisia and Egypt, and that in some ways the reproposition, I would say, of democracy on the agenda in these movements, or as a central political concept in the movements in Europe, is a result of that, of having taken up the inspiration of the North African struggles. Right, I'll probably go into that part a little bit later. So if you will then come back to my first difficulty, which is about the discontinuity of the movements, like their ephemeral nature, the fact that they come and seem to explode for a few months and then disappear. There's one way you could address that, or that I would say is now a traditional way of addressing it. In fact, some ways that I respond to certain people who are challenging the movements or declaring them failed because they couldn't be sustained over time. There's one response that would say something like, well, actually, there's a hidden continuity that you're just not seeing. And I'm thinking this is a little bit like the response that Karl Marx gives in the 18th Brumaire when he's talking about the French revolutionary struggles. So Marx is writing in 1850, and looking at French revolutionary history, it too is completely discontinuous. I mean, there was a spark in 1789, 1815, 1830, 1848, all failures. But Marx isn't particularly deterred by that failure. Rather, his metaphor, the famous metaphor for this, is that it's the revolutionary process is like a mole that burrows underground. And at certain moments it pops up and you see it. So you see it in 1789. You see the mole again in 1815. In 1830 it pops up again. But he says, he even goes further than that. In the meantime, the mole has been working underground. It's been burrowing. And so that when it pops up 15 years later or 48 years later, whenever, it's made progress. And so Marx has this idea that despite his conviction about the French revolutionary process, and perhaps his optimism, if someone is going to call it that. I dislike that word optimism, by the way. I feel like every time someone says it about me, I feel like it's an insult. I feel like they mean it as... No, I didn't mean you at all. But it seems to be often used as you believe things will be better, but you have no reason to. Like, that it's a emptiness rather than... But I don't think that's what Marx has confidence. I think that's different than optimism. In any case, because reasons for it. But what I'm trying to point out here is that Marx's metaphor assumes or proposes a hidden continuity of a seemingly discontinuous revolutionary struggle. So one could say that. One could respond to someone today and say, like, okay, you think the alter-globalization movement is a failure. You thought Occupy Wall Street was a failure. Maybe they were failures, but they're really just appearances in a hidden continuous process that, like that mole, is just appearing occasionally. Like I said, to certain people, I'm perfectly willing to give that response. I'm not satisfied with it, though, personally. So that's where my problem comes in. I do think that we need to construct a continuity, that I'm not satisfied with that faith that Marx has in the progress of revolutionary struggle, despite that seemingly discontinuous nature. And so that's what leads Tony and I, and this could act as a presentation of that little pamphlet of ours, which is that we want to think about a constituent process that can construct a continuity of the, as so far, discontinuous movements. And so what we're banking on with this, maybe this is the wager. The wager is that we don't only have two choices, either anarchy or authority, either spontaneism or a fixed order. That instead, and when I say anarchy, what I mean is something like the cliche of anarchy, rather than what most anarchists mean by it. But anyway, what I think that instead of these two choices, what we can construct is a constituent process that makes an open continuity of active political participation. That's what we want to end up with. So then I come up with my second problem. So Tony and I, in the second half of this pamphlet, we talk quite a bit about this, what might be the such a constituent process. My second problem is this. So my first problem is about discontinuity, how to regard the discontinuity. My second problem is about this notion of constitution itself. A good friend of mine who teaches at the law school and who's a specialist in constitutional law, who's very indulgent of me because I'm not a specialist in that thing. He was very interested in reading our pamphlet, and he says he found it very exciting. But he says that anyone who's a professional law professor would not understand what we mean by constitution. Like they have no idea what we mean when we say it. Like you might, if I were someone else, I might be discouraged by such a fact. I'm somewhat encouraged by it. Like I think that part of what the challenge is to think constitution or constituent process differently, but that does require some explanation. So that's what I want to come up with here. I guess I want to try to address these two problems I have: the one about the discontinuity and what, in a way to address it, a constituent process could mean or could look like. We're together so far? Okay. So I should be brief about the, I was, in order to, there's another thing that Tony and I do, and I think it's typical of co-authors that because we mostly have fun when we're writing together, we create all kinds of, I call them jokes. I think they're a little bit more serious than jokes. But one of our jokes in this is about the U.S. Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. And so in some ways what we're reading the current state of the movements as something like a Declaration of Independence. Like what the movements have been really good at is declaring truths and rights. But what they've not been particularly good at is constituting a new society. And so the movement between 1776 and 1787 is partly what we're trying to imagine. Like, what would that be? Of course, we don't really want to end up at 1780. We don't want to really end up at something like the U.S. Constitution. And thank goodness my friend, the law professor, recognizes that we don't. So I'm assured of not actually being recognizable by lawyers. So that by them. So anyway, you get where I am now. So let me start this way then. One way to characterize the demands and aspirations of the encampments and occupations that began in 2011 is in terms of the right to the common both as object of struggle and as form of organization. And as form of organization, I consider it closely related to the demand for democracy, or the demand to renew democracy. And I do, like I just said, understand the kinds of claims of inalienable rights to the common, like the claim to the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or even the claim to that all are created equal, that are found in the U.S. Declaration. I'm not usually so U.S.-centric in what I say, so I feel like I have to apologize for it. But I think those aspects of U.S. history have been imposed on just about everyone else in the world. So I hope they sound familiar enough to you. So let me say what I mean by the common first, and then why these movements might be considered as proposing a right to it. For me, to understand the common, I think one has to recognize a crisis, or it's meant, I think the thinking of the common is meant to recognize a crisis in terms of our conceptions of the economy and politics, really. I think we're often just given two choices in this regard, like that the evils of the market and of private property will be addressed by and corrected by public property or the state. And then the evils of the state and public property will have to be corrected by the market and private property. Instead, it seems to me that both of these notions are dead. I think both of them are something like zombies. Like, I'm not sure who still believes, or maybe people still believe. I think in that the market will bring democratic equal outcomes, that will bring freedom, anything like that. I don't really think people believe that. Or even the public property, meaning control regulation of the state, some sort of Keynesian and or socialist solution. That too seems to me like a dead a dead idea that people more or less recognize as dead, and that they function like zombies in the sense that they still continue to walk around and do things, sometimes horrible things, but everyone already knows they're dead. So it's in that context, or at least it's from that perspective, maybe I posed that a little bit too strongly for you, but that I think about the common as another way of, another option, that those are not our only two options. So the common is neither public nor private, neither state nor market. Here there's obviously a confusion when I say public and public property in contrast to the common, but what I mean is something rather narrow. I'm thinking of public property and the public here as simply that which is directed and regulated by the state. There are many other ways in English and in German that we use the concept public, but that's what I'm referring to here. So in some sense you could say that the common is a critique of property or refusal of property as such, either public property or private property. Insofar as property means monopoly of decision making and limited access. Property always is a kind of enclosure. Public property too. I mean, I would say. What do I mean by that? Like, because that might not sound right to you. Well, I mean, partly I'm thinking about, you know how Reclaim the Streets in Britain or Critical Mass, the bike people that probably exist here too, you know, which take over the street by all the bikes in them or something like that. They demonstrate the way, I mean, because the police tell them pretty quickly that the streets are not theirs. Like they chant, whose streets are streets? And then the police say, no, not your streets. They're the state streets, and that you can have access to them at times, but the access is limited and decision-making are limited by the state or public authority. That's something like that. So I'm thinking of the common then as neither public property nor private property. So what it would be, here would be a definition of the common for me. The common is defined by shared open access and democratic collective self-management. That's the way it defines it as not property, neither public property nor private property. Important for me is that the common is not spontaneously organized, not conceived as spontaneously organized, but instead implies institution, management, regularized practices. This is where Tony and my notion of the common and our circle, let's say, people we're working with on this, I think coincide with the work of Elinor Ostrom, who's well known for talking about the common, insofar as she too insists on the management of the common, on the non-spontaneous nature of the common, the need to create institutions, as long as you think about institutions as kind of regularized practices. And one of the reasons I think this is extremely important is that without it, the notion of the common could easily fall into a kind of nostalgia for pre-modern, pre-capitalist social formations without recognizing the hierarchical organization that those societies brought to the management of the common. I think that the management and institutions and practices themselves have to be subject of analysis in order so that notions of the common don't simply bring with them hierarchical organizations of decision-making and access. Okay, so let me say just a few more things about the common, and then I'll move on, just so that you have an idea of what I mean by it. It's important to me that the common be understood both as material resources, but also as immaterial resources or relationships. That it's extended in both realms. I mean, the first one you might think of material goods, including the earth, the forests, its ecosystem, the Earth's ecosystem, etc. And as an immaterial good, think about it common as cultural goods, but also code, ideas, relationships, images. And extending the common in both realms is both, I think, useful and even exciting idea for me, partly in that it brings together conceptual and social struggles, conceptual paradigms and social struggles that have been at times difficult to bring together. And I'm thinking particularly about ecological struggles and anti-capitalist political struggles. I found very interesting, and I was very excited by the 2009 Copenhagen UN Climate Summit, partly because it was bringing together, not in the summit itself, of course, but in the streets outside of it, two streams of European activism that hadn't worked particularly well together before, but were both struggling in terms of the common. Ecological movements here focused primarily on climate change, and anti-capitalist movements that were focused also on the common, but generally on the immaterial forms of the common, on our sharing of code, of cultural products, of ideas, of books, etc. So I thought it's exciting to bring them together, exciting that they're both focusing on the common. But here it revealed what at least for a while seemed like quite a difficulty to me, which is that the characteristics of the common that the two were focused on, the two streams of activism, had certain fundamental differences. And what I'm thinking of primarily is that the ecological notions of the common fundamentally saw the common as limited and restricted, because the earth itself, of course, is limited, and so is its water, and all of its ecosystems are limited, and we have to learn to manage it given those limits this way. Whereas in general, the anti-capitalist movements that I was thinking of, say the inheritors of the legacies of the altered globalization movement, primarily focused on notions of the common that were reproducible, not infinite, but reproducible in an unlimited way, like code, cultural products, ideas, images, don't have the same kind of limitations. And hence, at the protests themselves, I was interested in the conflicting slogans. So, yeah, for instance, for the anti-capitalist movements, one of the, I find, most charming slogans of the last 10 years, there was, we want everything for everyone. Yeah. I think it's a lovely slogan. But as you can imagine from the ecological perspective, this sounded like mutually assured destruction, like more stuff. Like it's just a terrible idea for them. Whereas I remember one of the placards for at the legal march at the Copenhagen Climate Summit from the ecological stream was there is no planet B, which makes sense. I mean, we're stuck with this planet. It's limited. We have to work with that. But, for the altered globalization people, it sounds like Margaret Thatcher saying there is no alternative. Because for them, there always is another world possible. Like that's it. Whereas the ecologists were saying, look, no, there's not another world possible. In fact, this world's probably not possible anymore either. But it was focusing on the limits. As you see, now I've since thought maybe some way the problem is mine, or rather that the core that unites the two groups and their political action was really in a different realm. Like, I think that what's central to the common is not so much the object or even its qualities, like whether they're limited or reproducible, but the mode of organization or management. Like, open access certainly will be different for different objects, for water or for music, but what's central is the mode of democratic decision-making that manages them. So the common, then, is not only, or maybe even primarily, an economic issue about property, but really a political issue about democratic decision-making. In this way, if one were to look at it from this way, then contemporary social movements certainly are oriented towards material and immaterial forms of the common, but most importantly and essentially, they're focused on the common as a form of organization. So what I mean is, rather than the water or the music here, we regard the political process itself as something we share, to which we have open access, and in which we manage collectively. Like that, treating the political process as common, that's something like what Tony and I mean by the concept of multitude. That's what I would... And as you could see, the notion of a General Assembly, I would say, is to try to approximate that, to experiment with that. These General Assemblies of the encampments were all about having open access to the word, to speaking, and to try to construct often failed, often really boring, but try to construct processes in which there could be a mechanism for equal collective decision-making. That's something like what I mean. I'll say one more thing about the common, and then I'll cut short the second part. But this one seemed. I thought I should say something more about the relation between the public and the common. And the easiest example for me, or the clearest one for me, is about the situation in many of the so-called progressive governments in Latin America in relationship to the common. So let me start with just a specific example in Bolivia about water rights. This seemed to me, there was a struggle that started in 2000, and it started in Cochabamba, a city in the middle of Bolivia, about the privatization of water. It was a classic anti-neoliberal struggle, but one aimed at the common. So anti-neoliberal struggle in the sense that the IMF recommended to the Bolivian government that it privatize the water system because its water rates were irrational. Irrational, of course, meant that the government paid more water to provide water to people than it got back in payment, and so it was irrational. So the Bolivian government, of course, accepted the suggestion of the IMF and sold the water rights to a international conglomerate led by Bechtel, a U.S. corporation. And promptly, a anti-privatization struggle arose about the water. And that struggle together, starting in 2000, there was together with that another struggle in 2003 about gas in Bolivia. So there was a so-called war on water and then the war on gas. In 2003, led directly to the election of Evo Morales in 2005. As this election, he came to power on the backs of these movements, which, as I say, were anti-privatization, but they were also about the common. So they were for the common in the sense that insisting the water is ours, the water belongs to all of us, and also, maybe even more importantly, that the form of struggle itself, which was based on the community form of the indigenous participants in the struggles, that making this the form of organization of the struggles common, let's say, was the second characteristic to the object of the struggles being about the common, being about water. Well, since the election of Evo in 2005, I wouldn't say that the new government has continued the neoliberal practices, but instead has substituted for a strong state program that continued much of the modernization economic processes that the previous governments had. In Latin America now, there's discussions about extractivism, like they continue the extractivist practices by which they've grouped together like not only the large-scale mineral mining and oil and gas, but also monocultural things like soy, stuff like that. In any case, so the accusation of the same social movements that were active in bringing the Evo Morales to power have now been attacking the government itself, continuing the struggle in the name of the common. So that I think what has been set up is a kind of double combat, like that there's both of these movements that are really aimed at the common. There's been a double combat where they fight with the public against the private, like against privatizations for the public, and then against the public for the common. So that I guess I would say that the public plays an almost intermediary role in the struggles that are aimed at the common. It was less clear than I planned it to be. Let me give you one more example so that one. I think that something similar goes on in many of the student movements, and I wouldn't be surprised, although I know less about the student movement in Austria, but I know maybe in Quebec is what I know better, but you can tell me if it corresponds to things here. A lot of the student movements that I've been involved with are really aimed at the common. In this case, what I mean by making education common, by a new form of education to which we not only have open access, but that we have collective management over its organization. But what they've been forced to do instead, and rightly so, is to defend public education against privatization. Now, if that were really, I think that that's not. Of course, there are different sectors within these student struggles, but there are many sectors for whom just defending that old public education that we hated in the first place is really not a very inspiring goal against this privatization. So that there's a kind of double struggle that has to go on, which is together with the public against the private, against the privatization of education, but then a simultaneous struggle against the public and the traditional public university we've had, which is out of our control, which limits access, etc., in the name of a new form of education, which here I'm trying to capture with some notion of the common. All of that, both to give you an idea of what I mean by the common, and also some idea that it's not. I don't see this argument about the common as a kind of allergy to the state or a complete refusal of any sort of strategic struggles with the state, but that often, in fact, struggles for the common, this is what I was trying to suggest, find themselves in a position where they have to both struggle with and against the state, against the private. I see it, there's something like a triangle involved there. I'll give you just a brief idea about the second part about right, like what I would mean by right. And I could just quickly say that if I do want to say that these encampments and occupations have proposed rights, like a right to the common, it doesn't. I'm certainly not thinking of a right in a relatively standard sense as deriving from an appeal to a sovereign authority. Like, it's not that the claim of a right in this case is guaranteed, provided or guaranteed by the sovereign. That's at least one notion, one prevalent notion of rights that this doesn't correspond to. Like even when Hannah Arendt says, I was thinking the classic of this would be something like Hobbes, for whom rights in a fundamental way flow from and are guaranteed by the sovereign. I was thinking that even when Hannah Arendt in her imperialism book talks about the right to have rights, which refugees lack, there too it's really a reliance on what having rights would involve is a reliance on a sovereign power, a nation state, or some other sovereign power that could guarantee rights. I would say even that these notions, vaguely Kantian notions of rights that flow from reason, have the same characteristics or form in the sense that that these rights, the active role is filled by the sovereign or reason, and those to whom the rights are granted are fundamentally passive. What I'm interested instead is an active notion of right, a notion of right in which those to whom the rights are granted are active in their conquest, in achieving them. One might think of this as something like a right to rebellion. Here too, plenty of classic texts to draw on about the right to rebellion, civil disobedience. Think, for instance, of John Locke, the last chapter in the second treatise on government, about the dissolution of government. There he poses something like a right to rebellion. Here too, it seems to me that this is useful and interesting. I think of it as a kind of destituent power, a power of destruction. And it might be useful because those who pose the right are active, but they're really not autonomous in my sense, because they're dependent on the sovereign in opposition to it. Like the right to disobedience, the right to rebellion is in some ways determined by the sovereign itself. So what I want instead is a conception of right that is both active and autonomous, in which the bearers determine and guarantee their own rights through struggle. So it's this that I want to take from Thomas Jefferson's Declaration. You know, certainly in Jefferson's Declaration in 1776, it's certainly not appealing to, it's not like, dear King George, please give us this right. It's rather posing our strength on the basis of struggle to claim these rights. And here again, claiming these rights not as an act of rebellion against the sovereign, but instead as a autonomous process of constitution. So then let me get you, this is the last bit that I want to say, and it's somewhat in to try to respond to my friend who's a specialist in U.S. constitutional law. So because I was trying to think of, and I found interesting streams within U.S. constitutional law. constitutional law is so national bound. Almost every tradition has such their own closed nature. But here's an instance, a stream within U.S. constitutional law that I found could be interesting, and I hope it's one that makes sense to you. What it's based on, a series of contemporary U.S. legal theorists who are fascinated by or reading a fragment written by President Lincoln, in which Lincoln declares this. Lincoln says, and here he's repeating something in Proverbs in the Bible. Lincoln says that the Declaration is an apple of gold in a frame of silver. And so the frame of silver is the Constitution. So Lincoln's claim is that, the Declaration is the center, this apple of gold, that is framed by the silver Constitution. So let me just give you a little context, too. So for Lincoln, writing, the mid-19th century, writing this during the U.S. Civil War, he wants to regard the Declaration as the fundamental document of the United States, and the Constitution is subordinated to it. Why does he want that? He wants the Declaration because it declares human equality, whereas the Constitution is a slaveholder's constitution based on slavery. And so what he says, the Declaration is the centerpiece, these apples of gold, that's framed by the silver, that the Constitution has to always make itself more adequate to the core principles of the Declaration. It's actually, the image of the gold and silver frame isn't quite right, because the frame should be liquid, it should be fluid, because the idea is that the Constitution changes historically in order to better frame. So the idea is that in the United States, with the Reconstruction after the Civil War in the 1860s, there's a change of that frame. With the New Deal in the early 20th century, there's another change of the frame. Civil rights in the 1960s, there's another change of the frame. And so that's what leads these current legal theorists in the U.S. to say that the Declaration is our Constitution, and that the Constitution, the written document, exists to serve the Declaration, something like that. I guess I would add to that is that I would try to make the image a little bit more, if you're following the image so far, which is that I think that the principles of the Declaration, these apples in the inside, also have to be mobile or fluid, in the sense that I think that the rights of the Declaration have to always be won in struggle. Like that it's not a one-time, that these kinds of rights are not ones that you can create once and for all, but instead have to continually be advanced or renewed. I had an example about W.E. Du Bois about that. I'm going to let that go. But I think you could see the idea. Well, the idea is that the importance is that that this notion subordinates the Constitution to the principles of the Declaration, and then also, I would add, subordinates the principles of the Declaration to the reality of struggle. Like that people win through struggle these rights, which then have priority over and forced to become adequate to themselves a constitution. Okay, so that brings me back. At least I want to end with just coming back to my general questions. Considering these movements oriented by the right to the common is helpful for me, partly in the sense that it shifts considerations on the failure or success of the movements, but it also accounts for their future prospects. You might ask, how are the encampments or occupations related to the right to the common? As I was saying before, it's true that within the encampments, and here I know the Spanish and the U.S. one's best, but it's true in different ways in the different ones. It's true within them, ecological concerns about shared social resources, notions of the commons this way were certainly part of the encampments. But what's most strongly characterized it for me is in terms of social organization, that the movements managed to relaunch the question of democracy, not only against tyranny, but also against representation, and to renew a call for democracy itself. It's the point at which I ought to say something about representation, but I think I've gotten too long about that. I'll come back to that later if someone's interested. The organization of occupied squares and encampments, I would say, express the right to the common in terms of a right to democracy. So I would say that these movements might continue and grow, but what they did most potentially is pose a new right or a new principle that could form the basis of a constituent process. You would say maybe a nonlinear process in the model of Marx's mold, but a nonlinear but continuous one. That's what I would require from it. So many things were accomplished by the movements of 2001, but one of the most important to me is the establishment of the right to the common, the right to democracy as a principle against which any future constituent power must be measured. I'll stop with that. Thanks very much.
So thank you so much, Michael Hardt. Before giving you the opportunity to enter the discussion, I will just have two short questions related to the two parts of your lecture. The first concerning the continuity. I totally understand that you don't want to talk about optimism, but about confidence. So I'm not insulting you anymore. But let's come back. No, just a joke. Just this. My first question would be: if this, you said we need to construct a continuity of the struggles, but somehow is this continuity and the confidence that is needed for constructing this continuity not a kind of narrative against the failure? Against the failures, isn't it just the negation of the failures? I think we have to face that. I mean, this is an important question.
Can I throw on? Yeah. For me, one of the theoretical challenges, but it quickly becomes a political challenge about continuity is this. Is it true that the only way to construct a political continuity is through centralization and leadership? Is there another form that can also construct continuity than that one? I feel, and so if so I guess my bet or my wager, that sounds better, is that we can construct. And so what do I mean also by continuity? I mean these. Maybe I should broaden that a little bit. These movements of 2011 were really great at organizing a square for a few months. Yeah. They were not particularly good at organizing an alternative society. And so that's what I mean by continuity. How can we move from the square to the social level? How can we and sustain that over time? So you see what I'm talking about, both spatially. And so I feel like I'm continually being told by a certain left, well, you need leaders. Where's your Martin Luther King? Where's your, X or Y? Where's your party? That sort of thing. And so my wager is, I think we can do it differently. I think that we can construct continuity in a democratic and horizontal way. Now, I might be wrong, but that's what I want.
That's what we all want.
Well, I'm not sure everyone wants that, but in any case, I at least wanted to make it clear what the is. But I'm not also pretending. I certainly don't have the blueprint for this or anything. But I hope to recognize. I think we can recognize elements of such a possibility in things that are already happening. and not just view it as a as a idle dream. Put it on something like that.
My second question, I will be very short because we have so many people here, and I'm sure everybody wants to ask something. I just want to come back to this notion of the common and the public. And, when we think about the public is also, you have a subjectivity of the public. We have the citoyenneté, and we have the citoyenneté of the social citoyenneté.
Right.
This is a very special subjectivity, and it is a subject who has rights vis-à-vis the social state.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is an important point, and what we are living now is the privatization of means also a decline of this subjectivity. A decline of the people who have the right to claim something from the social state. Also, this is a privatization. And so you just mentioned the subject, if I understood you correctly, the subject of the commons would be an active and autonomous subject. But he is in front of this privatization of these rights. This is the problem. So
right. That seems, or at least the way I'm understanding it, that's why and I think I didn't explain it well enough when I was trying this, why that, I gave you a very schematic example of Bolivia. It's more complicated than that. But what I wanted out of that was to recognize a certain situation in which it is necessary to, from my perspective, like aiming at the common, if one were to accept that for something, if one were to understand it and accept it, those are two big things. Aiming at the common, we do find ourselves often in the situation today that we need to defend the public against the private. I don't want to just be satisfied with that, though. Mm-hmm. I want to also then attack the public for the common. And what do I mean in this case? I mean, the notion of citoyen and republicanism is not all one. I mean, this is sometimes when the terms bleed. I mean, historically, now I'm feeling like university professor, but historically the notion of republicanism, it's not so terrible. Okay, I feel ashamed, but the notion of republicanism has a wide variety of meanings, which I think sometimes go from including the notion of an autonomous constituent social formation like the multitude and refusals of representation to thinking of the sovereignty of the people and the sovereignty of the state is almost mixing into one. So I think that I would like, let's see, I do feel I want to draw on that same tradition, but I guess I want only certain aspects of it and I want to contest others. Yeah, I don't know if that's a, but I guess also with the state, I share your desire to contest the privatization and its erosion of, the kinds of civic subjectivities that are being lost. Okay. I said that, and I don't quite believe what I just said. But you have to try things on before you. I mean, I do in a way, but I guess my hesitation. But this is not. I realize this is what it was implied in what I said, and not in what you said. I also have a certain disquiet, or maybe even fear of those who have a nostalgia for the subjectivities that now seem to me lost, of certain kinds of civil society formations, even of the corporativist trade union organizations that were powerful and wonderful in many respects in the past. There are certain ways in which I don't see a recuperation of those subjectivities, but instead the construction of new ones. Yeah. But I'm with you on the attack on the private. I mean, I didn't mean to imply that I wasn't.
I'm with you with this new subjectivity. I'm against this nostalgia. I totally agree with this.
Yeah, I imagine. That's why I was saying it was my own... But I assume everyone recognizes that nostalgia.
Yeah.
Okay.